The Betrayal Bake-Off. Chapter 1. The Sweet Discovery. The kitchen smelled of cinnamon, sugar, and a hint of butter, as it always did when Margaret was deep in her baking routine. Warm, inviting aromas curled around the room, transforming the space into her personal haven. Here, in the heart of her home, Margaret found solace in the precision and artistry of her craft. Baking wasn't just a hobby. It was her way of coping. The methodical sifting of flour, the gentle fold of the batter, and the satisfying hiss of cakes rising in the oven. All of it was a balm to her restless soul. Her lemon drizzle cake had earned first prize at the county fair 3 years running, and her brownies were whispered about with reverence among her neighbors. People came to her for comfort, for indulgence, and for the kind of sweetness that only her kitchen could provide. She was known for this, and for a long time, that was enough to make her feel valued. But recently, that feeling had begun to fade. As she hummed softly, mixing together a batch of batter for a new recipe she was testing, Margaret's thoughts wandered, as they often did these days, to Greg, her husband of almost 10 years. He had once been her greatest supporter, devouring her baked goods with a kind of boyish enthusiasm that made her heart swell. He used to brag about her to his friends, telling them she was the best baker in the world, that no one could touch her when it came to the perfect pie crust or a gooey-centered cookie. Lately, though, things had changed. It started subtly. Late nights at work that stretched into the early hours of the morning. Business trips that seemed oddly frequent for a man who claimed his company was cutting back on travel expenses. Phone calls that ended abruptly when she walked into the room. There were the shirts, too. His crisp, white work shirts that smelled faintly of a perfume that definitely wasn't hers. At first, Margaret had brushed it off. She told herself she was being paranoid, that Greg was under pressure at work, or that maybe his boss was truly demanding more of his time. Perhaps the perfume was just from one of those department store testers. He'd always been clueless about how easily scents could linger. But then there was the way Greg avoided her eyes when they talked, how he hesitated when she asked about his day. The distance between them had grown almost imperceptibly, but it was there, like a hairline crack in a window pane. Something you didn't notice at first, but that slowly spiderwebbed into something impossible to ignore. Margaret shook her head as she scraped the batter into the cake pan. She didn't want to believe it. She didn't want to acknowledge the possibility that Greg, the man she had built her life around, could be hiding something from her. But the signs were too obvious to dismiss anymore. She wasn't an idiot. The clatter of the oven door shutting broke the silence in the kitchen. Margaret set the timer, her hands moving mechanically as her mind raced. It wasn't just the late nights and the perfume. It was the text messages, too. She'd seen them once, just briefly, a few weeks ago when Greg had left his phone on the counter. She hadn't been snooping, not intentionally. It had buzzed, and her eyes had flicked over to the screen out of habit. The name, Vanessa, had popped up with a string of heart emojis, followed by a text that made her stomach drop. "Last night was amazing. Can't wait to see you again." Margaret hadn't confronted him then. She wasn't even sure why. Maybe it was shock. Maybe it was denial. She had simply pretended she hadn't seen it, focusing on frosting a batch of cupcakes instead. But the doubt had gnawed at her ever since, a slow, insidious erosion of trust that left her feeling hollow. Now, as she stood in her kitchen, the rhythmic hum of the mixer filling the room, Margaret's resolve hardened. She couldn't live like this, constantly wondering, second-guessing, doubting every smile Greg gave her. She needed to know for sure. With a calmness that surprised even her, she wiped her hands on her apron and reached for Greg's phone, which was conveniently sitting on the counter. He had stepped outside to get some fresh air, leaving the device behind in his usual careless way. The screen lit up under her touch, and before she could stop herself, she was scrolling through his messages. Her heart pounded in her chest, her pulse a steady thud in her ears as she navigated to his texts. There, at the top of the screen, was a name that now sent a chill down her spine. Vanessa. Margaret tapped on the thread and scrolled through the messages, her hands trembling slightly. She didn't know exactly what she was looking for. Proof, maybe, or some kind of explanation that would make this all a big misunderstanding. But the texts left no room for doubt. They were filled with pet names, inside jokes, and plans to meet up. The tone was intimate, casual, as if Greg had been seeing her for months. There were heart emojis, winking faces, and then a picture of Vanessa in a lacy red bra. Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. The words blurred in front of her as her throat tightened. A knot of rage and humiliation coiled in her chest, growing tighter with every message she read. There it was, the undeniable truth. Greg was cheating. Her fingers clenched around the phone, her knuckles turning white. For a moment, she imagined throwing it across the room, shattering it against the tiled floor. Or maybe smashing it with the rolling pin she had just used for the pie crust. But she didn't do any of that. Instead, she took a deep breath and carefully put the phone back in its place, leaving no trace that she had touched it. She had always been meticulous in the kitchen. She knew how to cover her tracks. The mixer clicked off, and the silence in the room was deafening, save for the slow ticking of the clock on the wall. Margaret stood motionless for a moment, staring at the phone as if it held the power to change everything. And in a way it had. Her world had shifted, fractured by the weight of the betrayal she could no longer ignore. She felt her knees weaken, her throat tightening with the sting of oncoming tears. But she didn't cry. Not yet. No, Margaret wasn't going to cry. She was going to bake. With that thought, a strange calm settled over her. She would deal with this, but on her terms. And Greg would never see it coming. Chapter 2. Sugar and Spice. That evening, Margaret sat at the dinner table across from Greg, watching him with an almost serene composure as he shoveled forkfuls of chicken parmesan into his mouth. She had prepared the meal with her usual care, ensuring every detail was perfect. The chicken was seasoned with fresh herbs, the parmesan crisp and golden, and the wine, a rich Cabernet, was chilled to perfection. To anyone else, this might have seemed like a typical Wednesday night in the Miller household, just another peaceful dinner for a couple married nearly a decade. But tonight was different. Margaret smiled sweetly as Greg looked up from his plate, chewing contentedly. His mouth was half full as he mumbled, "How was your day?" Margaret continued slicing into her chicken, her movements slow and deliberate. There was something oddly calming about the rhythmic scrape of the knife against her plate. "Oh, it was productive," she replied, her voice light and conversational, though a deeper current of satisfaction ran beneath her words. "I made a new cake today." Greg's eyes lit up, as they always did when dessert was mentioned. "Ooh, a new one? What kind?" Margaret's smile stretched wider, and she felt a flicker of something dark and thrilling twist in her chest. "Chocolate. Your favorite." Greg grinned like a child who had just been promised candy. "Can't wait to try it after dinner." Margaret raised her wine glass to her lips, her eyes never leaving his. "Oh, you'll definitely try it." As Greg continued talking, something about a stressful meeting at work, followed by a particularly demanding client, Margaret zoned out. She had mastered the art of appearing engaged while letting his words wash over her. Tonight, her thoughts were elsewhere, centered on the cake she had so carefully crafted earlier that afternoon. It sat in the fridge now, its glossy chocolate icing hiding the secrets she had so lovingly baked into it. From the outside, it looked like any of her usual decadent creations, a rich, moist chocolate cake with layers of ganache and a light dusting of cocoa powder. But this cake was special. It had a few extra ingredients, carefully selected and measured to create the perfect storm of discomfort for her unsuspecting husband. Nothing deadly, of course. Margaret wasn't about to stoop to murder. That would be too simple, too final. Besides, she had bigger plans for Greg, plans that would unfold slowly, one bite at a time. She wanted him to suffer, to feel his life unravel bit by bit, just like her own had over the past few months. Greg's voice broke through her thoughts, pulling her back to the present. "You're quiet tonight," he said, eyeing her over his wine glass. "Everything okay?" Margaret smiled again, the perfect picture of domestic contentment. "Everything's fine," she replied, taking a sip of her wine. "Just thinking about the cake." After dinner, Margaret cleared the plates, her movements efficient and controlled. As she brought the dessert plates to the table, Greg leaned back in his chair, rubbing his stomach. "I don't know if I have room for dessert," he said, though Margaret could tell by the way his eyes followed her every move that he had no intention of skipping the cake. "Oh, you'll want to make room for this," she said, setting a slice of the chocolate cake in front of him. She placed her own slice neatly beside her, though she had no intention of eating it. Tonight, this performance was all about him. Greg picked up his fork and cut into the cake, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. "Looks amazing, honey," he said, lifting a forkful to his mouth. Margaret watched intently as he took his first bite, her heart thudding quietly in her chest. For a brief moment, there was silence as Greg chewed, and then a smile spread across his face. "Wow, this is really good," he said, already reaching for a second bite. "What's in it?" Margaret leaned back in her chair, her smile never faltering. "Oh, just the usual," she said lightly. "Flour, sugar, butter, chocolate, and maybe a dash of revenge." Greg chuckled, completely oblivious to the venom in her words. "Well, whatever it is, it's delicious," he said, his voice muffled by another mouthful. Margaret took a slow sip of her wine, savoring the moment. She had done her research, of course. The cake wasn't poisoned or anything that dramatic. No, that would be far too easy, and Margaret was aiming for something more subtle. She had simply adjusted the balance of ingredients ever so slightly, enough to make the cake taste just a little off. Not so much that it would raise immediate suspicion. Greg would still eat it, especially with his sweet tooth, but enough to leave an unpleasant aftertaste. As she watched him wolf down his second slice, Margaret felt a strange, dark satisfaction. This was only the beginning. Soon, he would start to notice the little things. An upset stomach here, a strange rash there. It would all be so subtle, so carefully orchestrated, that he would never suspect it was her. Greg wiped his mouth with his napkin and reached for another piece. "I could eat this all night," he said, his voice full of that casual, easy charm that once would have made her heart flutter. Margaret's smile widened, though it no longer reached her eyes. "I'm glad you like it," she said, her voice smooth and sweet, though there was nothing sweet about the thoughts running through her mind. As Greg reached for his fourth slice, Margaret leaned back, crossing her arms over her chest as she watched him with a sense of growing satisfaction. He had no idea what was coming, but soon he would. This was just the first step, the appetizer in her carefully crafted menu of revenge. Her mind whirled with possibilities as she envisioned the weeks ahead. More cakes, more surprises hidden in each bite. It would be a slow burn, a gradual descent into discomfort and confusion for Greg. And the best part was, he would never see it coming. As Greg finished the last bite of his cake, he sighed contentedly. "Thanks for dinner, babe. You always know how to make the perfect meal." Margaret tilted her head, her smile frozen in place. "Oh, don't mention it," she said, her voice soft and laced with a darkness Greg couldn't hear. She collected the plates and returned them to the kitchen, her mind already spinning with ideas for tomorrow's dessert. Something with a bit more kick. Maybe a pie with a laxative twist, or cookies that left an itchy aftertaste. Yes, tomorrow would bring something new, something exciting. For now, though, she was content to let him sit with that faintly bitter taste lingering in his mouth, completely unaware that this was only the beginning. Chapter 3. Brownies with a Bite. In the early days of their marriage, Margaret's baking had been a love language. She would whip up batches of cookies, pies, and brownies, leaving sweet little notes for Greg. "I love you more than chocolate," she'd scribble on the paper napkin beside a warm plate of freshly baked goods, hoping to see his eyes light up with gratitude. Back then, her love had been genuine, her heart full of warmth. But those days were long gone. Now, her heart was hardened by betrayal, and her love language had twisted into something darker, revenge. This time, the brownies she baked for Greg weren't made out of love, but out of a carefully calculated desire to make him suffer, one bite at a time. Her award-winning brownie recipe, known for its rich, fudgy texture, had been altered in subtle but significant ways. Margaret had spent hours meticulously researching ingredients that could cause mild allergic reactions. Nothing too extreme, of course, just enough to make him uncomfortable. It had to be believable. She couldn't risk him growing suspicious. No, this had to be slow, methodical, and above all, invisible. That evening, Greg returned from work, looking tired, though Margaret couldn't tell if it was exhaustion or guilt weighing on him. She didn't care. The sooner she began the next phase of her plan, the better. "Hey babe, I made your favorite brownies," Margaret said, her voice light and cheerful as she greeted him at the door. She held the plate out to him, the warm, chocolatey aroma filling the air between them. Greg's face lit up as it always did when he saw her baking. "You're the best, you know that?" he said, grinning as he dropped his keys on the counter and leaned in to kiss her cheek. Margaret forced a smile and returned the kiss, swallowing the bile that rose in her throat. "I know," she replied, her voice sweet but hollow. Greg wasted no time grabbing a brownie from the plate, taking a large bite and closing his eyes as he savored the taste. "Oh man, these are amazing as usual," he mumbled through a mouthful of brownie, oblivious to the fact that they were laced with something far more sinister than love. Margaret watched him closely, every movement, every expression, as he devoured the brownies. She knew it would take some time. Her research had suggested about 20 minutes before the effects would begin, so she waited, quietly tidying up the kitchen, pretending to be her usual, doting self. Greg didn't notice her watching him. He never did. About 20 minutes later, as they sat together on the couch watching a TV show Greg had chosen, some mindless action movie, Margaret saw it happen. Greg's hand rose to scratch at his arm, casually at first, as if it was just a mild itch. Margaret's lips curled into a hidden smile. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice laced with just the right amount of concern. She even leaned toward him slightly, her eyes wide with faux innocence. Greg shrugged, still scratching, though now it was more. Pausing and making a face. "What's in this? It tastes weird." Margaret feigned innocence, placing a hand on her hip. "Oh, nothing strange. Just spinach, bananas, a little bit of protein powder," she said, her tone light and breezy. "It's supposed to be really good for digestion." Greg nodded slowly, though his brow furrowed as he took another hesitant sip. "I guess it's healthy," he muttered, though his face betrayed the fact that he wasn't enjoying it. Margaret fought to keep her expression neutral, knowing full well what was in store for him. She could already imagine the gurgling storm that was about to erupt in his stomach, the hours of discomfort he would face as the smoothie's extra ingredients worked their magic. She had been careful, adding just the right amounts of fiber and laxatives to make sure his day would be spent racing to the bathroom. "How thoughtful of you," Greg said after a moment, finishing the smoothie despite its odd taste. He wiped his mouth and gave her a grateful smile, completely unaware of what was coming. "You always take such good care of me." Margaret returned his smile, barely containing her laughter. "Anything for you, darling," she replied, her voice dripping with false sweetness. She gave him a playful wink, turning back to the kitchen counter to hide the smirk that was threatening to break through. Greg went about his morning routine as usual, oblivious to the ticking time bomb brewing in his stomach. Margaret watched him from the corner of her eye, waiting for the inevitable. It wouldn't take long, an hour, maybe two, before Greg would start feeling the effects. The discomfort would come on slowly, at first, a mild cramp here and there. But by the time he left for work, it would hit full force, and he would be in for a day he wouldn't soon forget. Margaret busied herself with cleaning up the kitchen, her heart pounding with anticipation. The smoothie had been just the right amount of sabotage, nothing too obvious, just enough to throw Greg's day into complete chaos. And the best part was, he had no idea. He never suspected a thing. To him, Margaret was still the doting wife, always there with a meal, a drink, or a smile. As Greg kissed her goodbye on his way out the door, Margaret waved him off with a cheerful smile. "Have a great day," she called after him, her voice filled with false enthusiasm. Greg smiled back, seemingly unaware of the storm brewing inside him. "You too, babe." Margaret closed the door behind him, her smile widening the moment he was out of sight. She leaned against the doorframe, her eyes gleaming with satisfaction. The smoothie sabotage had been a success, and she couldn't wait to hear about Greg's awful day later that night. She could already picture his face, confused, uncomfortable, maybe even a little embarrassed, when he came home, wondering what on earth had caused his sudden stomach problems. It was a small victory, but a satisfying one nonetheless. And as Margaret returned to the kitchen, humming softly to herself, she knew this was only the beginning. There were plenty more opportunities for sabotage ahead, and she was going to savor every single one. Chapter 5. Recipe for Disaster. Margaret's revenge had become an art form. Every morning, she'd rise early, donning her apron with an almost theatrical grace, as though preparing for a show. And in a way, she was. Each meal, each dessert, was a performance, carefully curated with just the right amount of malice hidden beneath layers of sugar and flour. Over the next few weeks, Greg remained blissfully unaware of the chaos slowly unfolding within his body. Margaret watched with quiet satisfaction as her subtle acts of culinary sabotage took their toll. The muffins she served for breakfast left Greg sluggish and bloated, his once flat stomach distended uncomfortably by midday. The cookies she packed for his lunch caused mysterious bouts of nausea that had him retreating to the restroom during his meetings. But every time he mentioned feeling unwell, Margaret. Intense. Yeah, I'm fine. Just itchy, I guess, he muttered, shifting in his seat. Margaret bit the inside of her cheek to keep from laughing. Maybe you're allergic to something, she suggested, her tone sweet and helpful. Greg frowned, his fingers now furiously scratching at the red, irritated skin on his arm. Allergic? Nah, I've never been allergic to anything before. It's probably nothing. He shrugged it off, oblivious to her hidden amusement. But as the minutes ticked by, the itching grew worse. Greg's once casual scratching turned into something more desperate. By the time they were ready for bed, the redness had spread across both his arms, and he was scratching with such intensity that Margaret was surprised he hadn't drawn blood. I don't know what's going on, Greg grumbled, staring at his arms in confusion. Must be something I ate. He glanced briefly at Margaret, but she was already slipping into bed, her face a mask of mild concern, though inside, she was reveling in every second of his discomfort. Maybe you should take some allergy medicine, Margaret suggested as she fluffed her pillow, watching him through half-lidded eyes. Just in case. Greg grunted, clearly annoyed but too tired to argue. He popped a pill and crawled into bed beside her, still scratching at his arms. I swear, it's never been this bad before, he muttered. Though his voice was muffled as he pressed his face into the pillow, Margaret said nothing, simply closing her eyes and letting a soft smile play on her lips. She lay there in the darkness, listening to the sound of Greg's restless tossing and turning, his occasional grumbles of frustration as the itching refused to subside. By the time Greg finally fell asleep, his arms still raw and red, Margaret was already dreaming. But her dreams weren't of sugar and chocolate, like they once had been. No, her dreams were filled with the many ways she could continue this quiet, relentless revenge. The brownies were just the beginning. Tomorrow, she would come up with something new, perhaps a pie, or a batch of cookies, each with a hidden ingredient carefully selected to make Greg's life just a little more unbearable. As she drifted off into a deep, peaceful sleep, Margaret's thoughts were consumed with possibilities. She had once loved Greg with all her heart, but now, her love had turned into something far more satisfying. A recipe for revenge that would play out one sweet bite at a time. Chapter 4. Smoothie Sabotage. The next morning, Margaret was up early, moving quietly in the kitchen as she prepared her latest concoction. Today's plan involved a smoothie, a healthy, green, seemingly innocent drink that Greg would never suspect of being tampered with. It was perfect, a blend of leafy greens, bananas, and protein powder, with a few not-so-standard additions. Margaret grinned to herself as she tossed a few extra ingredients into the blender. She'd carefully chosen them to wreak havoc on Greg's stomach, causing just enough discomfort to make his day miserable, but not so much that he would connect it to her. After all, she was just a caring wife making her husband a nutritious breakfast. Nothing suspicious about that. As the blender roared to life, Margaret felt a sense of satisfaction building inside her. She had always loved making smoothies in the mornings, a routine she and Greg used to share when their marriage was happier. But now, that love had transformed into something much darker. Every swirl of the blades was another small step toward Greg's undoing. When Greg finally stumbled into the kitchen, rubbing sleep from his eyes, Margaret greeted him with a bright smile. She placed a tall glass of the smoothie in front of him with a flourish, her eyes twinkling with hidden mischief. "I made it just for you," she said sweetly, her voice filled with faux affection. Greg blinked at her, surprised by her chipper mood but too tired to question it. "Thanks," he mumbled, reaching for the glass. He raised it to his lips, taking a long sip before. Played the part of the concerned, loving wife to perfection. "Oh, you poor thing," she'd say, her brow furrowing in mock sympathy. "It must be something you ate at work. I'm so sorry you're not feeling well." And Greg, too trusting to suspect her, always nodded, dismissing his symptoms as bad luck. "Maybe it's an allergy," he mused one evening after a particularly rough day. His face was pale, beads of sweat gathering on his forehead as he reclined on the couch. "I've never had issues with your cooking before, but maybe I'm developing something." Margaret bit back a smile. "Oh no, I hope it's not something serious," she cooed, bringing him a glass of water. "I'll be more careful. Maybe I should start using organic ingredients, just to be safe." Greg gave her a weak smile, still rubbing his stomach. "You're too good to me. You know that?" Margaret kissed his forehead, her eyes glinting with wicked satisfaction. "I know." Each new dish became more daring, her confidence growing with every successful deception. There was the garlic bread she served one night, perfectly golden and buttery, but seasoned with just enough laxatives to send Greg running to the bathroom multiple times throughout the evening. "It must have been something I ate at lunch," he groaned afterward, collapsing in bed, pale and exhausted. And then there were the pancakes, fluffy, sweet, and utterly irresistible. Margaret had poured extra syrup over Greg's, stack with a loving smile, watching him devour them without a second thought. What Greg didn't know was that she had ground up small amounts of a herbal diuretic into the batter, ensuring he'd spend the rest of his Sunday running to the restroom, his plans for a relaxing day ruined. Margaret's favorite moment, though, had been the chili. She'd cooked it for their weekly movie night, a tradition they'd started early in their marriage. Greg had always loved her chili. It was hearty, comforting, and made just the way he liked it. But this time, she added something extra, an ingredient known for its intensely spicy aftereffects. The look on Greg's face after his third bite had been priceless. His eyes widened, his face flushed, and sweat poured down his temples. "What's in this?" he sputtered, reaching for his water glass. Margaret feigned concern, though inside, she was cackling. "Oh no, is it too spicy? I used the same amount of chili powder as always." Greg downed his water, his face a mix of pain and confusion. "I don't know what it is," he said, wiping his brow, "but it's really kicking in. Do you want me to make something else?" Margaret offered, trying her best to sound apologetic. Greg shook his head, determined. No, I'll finish it. I'm sure it's just me. I'm probably just more sensitive today." Margaret nodded, watching as he struggled through the meal, sweat dripping down his neck, his eyes watering with each bite. By the end of the night, Greg had abandoned the movie, curling up on the couch, holding his stomach. "You must be coming down with something," Margaret suggested, handing him a warm blanket. "You've been feeling off for weeks now." Greg groaned, his head buried in the pillow. "Yeah, I think I should see a doctor." Margaret's smile widened, though Greg couldn't see it. "That's a good idea," she said softly, rubbing his back. "I just want to make sure you're okay." The truth was, Margaret didn't care if Greg went to a doctor. It wouldn't matter. The beauty of her plan was in its subtlety. Everything she'd done, every recipe she'd altered, could be passed off as a mistake, a coincidence, or even Greg's own deteriorating health. There was no concrete evidence pointing back to her, just a string of bad luck that seemed to follow Greg wherever he went. To him, she was still the perfect wife, sweet, caring, always ready to make his favorite meals. But to Margaret, every plate she placed in front of him was another step toward his downfall. Her revenge was slow, methodical, and best of all, delicious. As the weeks went by, Greg's health deteriorated further. He began missing work, calling in sick more often, complaining of stomach pains, headaches, and fatigue. Margaret played the concerned wife to the hilt, offering to run errands for him, fetching him tea, and even suggesting new, healthy recipes to help him feel better. But in the end, Margaret's revenge wasn't just about the meals. It was about watching Greg suffer, knowing he had no idea what was really going on. It was about the power she held, the control she had over his life, all served with a smile. And as she watched Greg fall apart, piece by piece, bite by bite, she felt a satisfaction that no dessert had ever given her before. This was Margaret's recipe for disaster, and it was only just beginning. Chapter 6. The Anniversary Cake. The day of their 10th wedding anniversary had finally arrived, and Margaret had meticulously orchestrated the grand finale of her revenge. It was fitting, really, 10 years of lies and deceit, culminating in this one spectacular moment. She had been preparing for weeks, ensuring that every detail of her plan was perfect, down to the last crumb. In the kitchen, a towering cake sat proudly on the counter, its rich, moist layers of chocolate stacked high and frosted with a smooth, decadent buttercream. The surface gleamed under the soft lighting, every swirl of the frosting immaculate, every decorative flourish placed with precision. To anyone else, it was a masterpiece. To Greg, it was about to become a nightmare. That evening, when Greg walked through the door, Margaret was ready. She greeted him with her warmest smile, a practiced expression of love and affection that concealed the storm brewing beneath the surface. "Happy anniversary, darling," she said with mock enthusiasm, gesturing to the magnificent cake as though it were a prize. Greg's face lit up in surprise, his eyes widening at the sight of the cake. "Wow, this looks incredible," he exclaimed, taking in its flawless appearance. He moved toward the cake, his mouth already watering. Margaret watched him carefully, her hands folded neatly in front of her, her heart beating steadily as she handed him a knife. "Go ahead, cut yourself a piece," she said sweetly, barely able to contain the dark satisfaction bubbling within her. Greg, oblivious as always, eagerly took the knife and carefully sliced into the cake. As he pulled the slice free, revealing the moist, rich chocolate beneath the smooth layers of buttercream, something unusual caught his eye. There, written in delicate script on the inside of the cake, just beneath the top layer of frosting, were two simple words: "I know." For a moment, Greg didn't react. He stared at the words, blinking in confusion, his brain struggling to process what he was seeing. His hands trembled slightly, the slice of cake teetering on the edge of the plate. Margaret stood perfectly still, her eyes fixed on Greg as she savored the silence that followed. She had imagined this moment so many times, the precise instant when Greg's world would come crashing down. The look of confusion, fear, and disbelief on his face was even more satisfying than she had dreamed. Greg's face drained of color as realization began to settle in. His hands shook more violently now, and he set the plate down on the table, his wide eyes darting between the cake and Margaret. "Margaret, what is this?" he stammered, his voice shaky and strained. Margaret smiled, a serene, almost angelic smile, as though this moment was as light and casual as any other. "Just a little message," she said, her tone soft but laced with hidden steel. "For you." Greg swallowed hard, his throat dry, the color completely gone from his face. "But I don't understand." Margaret let out a soft, knowing laugh. "Of course you don't." She picked up her purse from the nearby chair, slinging it over her shoulder with a casual grace that belied the weight of the moment. She took a deep breath, feeling lighter than she had in years. "You don't need to understand, Greg. Just know that I know, and I'm done." Greg's mouth opened as if to protest, but no words came out. He stood frozen in place, his hands limp by his sides, his brain struggling to catch up to what was happening. The life he had so carefully constructed, the lies he had told, the secrets he had hidden, it all unraveled before him in an instant. And there was nothing he could do. Margaret, meanwhile, felt a sense of peace wash over her. She had played her part perfectly. For weeks, she had woven her revenge into the fabric of their everyday life, never raising suspicion, never tipping her hand. And now, at the culmination of it all, she was walking away, leaving behind the wreckage of Greg's betrayal with nothing but a smile on her face. Without another word, she turned on her heel and walked out the door, her footsteps echoing in the silence of the house. Greg stood there, alone in the kitchen, staring at the cake, a slice still in his hand and his mouth hanging open, as if the words written inside it had stolen not only his breath but his entire sense of reality. The anniversary cake sat untouched on the counter, a monument to Margaret's final act of defiance and to Greg's downfall. Margaret didn't look back. She didn't need to. The message had been delivered. Epilogue. The final bite. As Margaret drove away from the house that had once been her home, an overwhelming sense of liberation washed over her. The weight she had carried for months, no, years, was finally gone, lifted with each step of her carefully crafted revenge. It was almost hard to believe that it was over, but the grin that crept across her face told her otherwise. She gripped the steering wheel, the cool leather smooth beneath her fingertips, and let out a long, contented sigh. The evening had gone exactly as she had imagined it would. Greg, standing there with that stupid look of confusion on his face, the anniversary cake in his hands, utterly oblivious to the slow destruction she had orchestrated. Every slice of cake, every bite of the poisoned relationship they had shared, had been served with a side of her cold, sweet revenge. He would never see it coming, not fully, not ever. As Margaret pulled into a quiet parking lot, the sound of the tires crunching on gravel matched the finality of her plan. She parked the car, resting her head against the back of her seat for a moment, allowing herself to fully absorb the satisfaction of what she had done. It wasn't just the grand finale that filled her with triumph, it was every little step leading up to it. The brownies that had left Greg scratching his skin raw, the smoothies that sent him running to the bathroom, the meals that had turned his stomach just enough to make him doubt himself. Every bite had chipped away at him, piece by piece, until the final words, "I know," were the only thing left standing between them. She glanced at her reflection in the rearview mirror, and a smile spread slowly across her face. Her eyes sparkled with a confidence she hadn't seen in herself for years. Not since before Greg's betrayal. Not since before she had felt like her world was crumbling. But now, she wasn't the victim anymore. No, she had reclaimed her power, bit by bit, dish by dish, and tonight, she had delivered the final blow. "Now," Margaret said softly to her reflection, running a hand through her hair and adjusting her lipstick. She savored the moment, the sense of victory settling in her bones. "Who's ready for dessert?" With one last glance at the mirror, she straightened up, her shoulders set with determination. Her future lay ahead of her, sweet and full of possibility, just like the desserts she had always loved to create. Only this time, she was the one savoring the final bite. She reached into her purse, pulling out a small, beautifully wrapped box of chocolates she had prepared for herself, her own personal celebration for a job well done. Popping one of the chocolates into her mouth, she closed her eyes and smiled again, the rich, bittersweet taste filling her senses. The end.